think
Or
so.
do you want to say anything first, Yellow, or you want me to cover the housekeeping?
Sure, I can kick us off. Good morning, everyone. I'm Yellow Breen. I'm the CEO of Maine Development Foundation. Welcome to our third session of Policy Leaders Academy this cycle. Maine Economy 2, the road to recovery. We're thrilled that we've got a all-star, high-powered lineup of the co-chairs and a prominent member of the Governor's Economic Recovery Committee. For those of you that were with us on Wednesday for kind of economic fundamentals, I know at the end everyone was begging for actionable solutions, and we promised you those. So be careful what you ask for. You're about to get a lot of that. I know that Lori and Josh were able to present yesterday to the Appropriations Committee. And we are recording this session, so we've had a little bit more drop off in attendance today than the first two sessions. Friday before the holidays, probably not surprising, but we will be recording this, and I'll come back to that so that as many folks among your colleagues who you know would want to see this can benefit from it. So those recordings have been going out immediately after the sessions. But I'll turn it over to our incredibly able lead staff on this, Julie Bean, for the logistics, and Mike Higgins, who's also on your screen. The two of them are really the guts behind the hard work on Policy Leaders Academy. I just get to show up and say good things about them and our presenters. So Julie will cover logistics, and I'll circle back, I think, to our partner thank yous, Julie, after you do that.
All right. Good morning, everybody. So we're together till 9:30 today. The first half hour will be straight presentations. So if you could hold your questions until after that, then we'll open it up for discussion. In the meantime, you can use the chat function if you'd like to say anything or ask a question, and then we can come back to it. But when we open it up, there are few enough of us on that I think you could just jump in if you have a question. But if you'd like to use the raise hand feature, you can go to the participants button on your toolbar and you'll see a raise hand, and you can click that and you'll go to the front, you'll go in the queue and I can call on folks. And I'd say that covers it. All right, back to you, Yellow.
Great, thanks, Julie. For those of you joining us for the first time, we've been thrilled to be part of Policy Leaders Academy for over 3 decades now at MDF. And it really is a program by, for, and of the legislature. We are privileged to do this by the courtesy of the Legislative Council. And we really try to create a learning environment that gives you a great grounding to be more effective policymakers in an environment where you can really kick the tires on ideas and issues, and where no question is off limits, and hopefully without fear that of any judgment or recrimination. So we just try to create a healthy learning environment for you as legislators. I want to recognize our partners who make this possible. We could not do this not only without the support, hard and soft, from the Legislative Council, but from Maine Community Foundation and Maine Health Access Foundation make it possible for us to do all of the staff time on this that makes it possible. And then we have planning partners that were on your screen in terms of UMaine System, University of Maine, Educate Maine, and the Maine State Chamber, who give us a lot of ideas and content experts as well. So we could not do this without a lot of partners. I think that's the nature of any great work here in Maine. So without further ado, I want to introduce our guests and get them rolling. And I should say we're joined by Maria Povic from the Governor's Office of Policy, Innovation, and the Future, who was the lead staff to the Governor's Economic Recovery Committee. And I think Josh and Lori will describe what a heavy lift that was, and how many people contributed to make it successful. So Maria's here to help not only run the show, but probably can help if there's only questions that only she can answer. And I want to introduce our leads. Lori LaChance, known to many of you, held my role here at MDF for a number of years, and certainly responsible for a lot of the signature programs that we've become known for. In 2012, Lori became Thomas College's 5th president and first female and first alumna to lead the college in its century and a quarter history. She served 3 governors as the Maine state economist. She was an economist in the private sector for Central Maine Power. She's received honors more numerous to recount. and is just an unbelievable, passionate Maine, Piscataquis County native and the co-chair of the Economic Recovery Committee. She is joined by her co-chair, Josh Broder. Let me pull Josh's resume up. Josh is the head of Tilson Technology, and I think for about a decade, Tilson has been on the Inc. 5000 list of fastest growing companies in the country. It's just incredible what Josh has done with that company, which provides a whole host of broadband planning, deployment, and even build and lease services across the country. Josh cut his teeth as an Army officer. And I will say, while it might not come up today, Josh and Tilson have probably done more than just about any individual or company in Maine when it comes to finding creative ways to employ veterans and convince others around the state and the country to employ military veterans. Josh also has a lot of other services in the fire, both for-profit and volunteer. And then finally, the co-chairs are joined by outstanding ERC member Tae Chung. Tae, let me pull your bio up so I don't mangle it. But Tae is a Portland City Councilor and works on an array of immigrant and refugee issues. Most lately at Catholic Charities, where he's the director of social enterprise and workforce. He's been working with immigrant and refugee populations for over 20 years as an educator, advocate, policymaker, social service provider, and a business advisor. He is a prominent speaker in a lot of different venues across Maine and beyond. Also has received so many recognitions and awards that are impossible to recount here. He's the first Asian American elected to the Portland City Council, Portland School Committee, and was the senior class president, co-president at Deering High School, where he's undefeated lifetime in high school debate against yours truly. So without further ado, I will turn it over to our three panelists to get going.
All right, I'll share the slides now.
Thank you all so very much for giving us this opportunity to present our work. It's been quite a ride. It was late April when the governor called us and asked us to form an economic recovery committee, recognizing, I think very wisely, that he wanted a group that would take the eyes off the current fire burning in front of us and lift our eyes to the future, so that when the economy did settle out after the pandemic became contained and the economy started to grow, that we would be able to find a path forward that would catalyze that growth as quickly as possible. While our task seemed very difficult, from the time she called us, we met within 12 days. We were given only two things: a charge, and our charge was to develop recommendations that would stabilize the state's economy and build a bridge to a future prosperity in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we were given a due date of early December to get these recommendations to you and to her administration, and to be prepared for when that day comes, that the pandemic starts to get behind us and we can pick up the ball and run with it towards the future. We very quickly broke our work into two phases. The first phase we reported on in July 15th with a report on recommendations to stabilize and support the economy, because we very quickly realized with this group of 45 individuals from all sectors and all geographies of the state that we could not simply move by the economic pain and despair that was present. We could not start that process of lifting our eyes to the future until we addressed at least some of the basic needs of our people and our economy. So our first report focused on that, which we'll share with you. And our second phase, which is the bulk of our work that we produced for our second report, was in the sustain and grow. And that is the strategies to consider how that bridge would be built and how we would actually not just shore up the foundation, but really build the transformational investments that would move this economy to the next level. Next slide, Josh. Or Maria, next slide. Thank you. We broke into initially 6 teams, and we were very fortunate to have some phenomenal leaders step forward to lead those teams. All ideas that we present bubbled up from the committees. The committees had a vast and diverse membership, and all ideas came up through them. And then we worked as a committee of the whole to narrow the priorities, because we knew if we brought you too many priorities, it would be the equivalent of having no priorities. So the ultimate recommendations in our December report are only 8, which we will explain in a little detail, and then allow you to ask questions after that. I'll turn it to Josh.
You hear? So on July 15th, we made a recommendation for 3 big initiatives with state coronavirus relief fund, or CRF funds in mind from the CARES Act. And in doing that, we just recognized that while we were focused on a 10-year horizon of economic recovery, given the nature of the emergency burning in front of us, we had to address building a bridge from where particularly employers and Maine people were trying to get through, an incredibly difficult time. If you'll recall, the economy was in free fall at the time, and we didn't know how low it was going to go. And the idea of having permanent economic damage, of businesses not just having a bad year, of nonprofits not just having a dip in revenue, but perhaps being gone and closing their doors forever, would put us in a much more difficult place to recover from. And at the time, I don't think we also knew whether or not we'd be able to go back to in-person education, or what the sort of bottoming of unemployment would be, and what that impact would have on people. So we recommended 3 baskets of support to try and get us to a place where we could then do the hard work of planning for a longer term recovery to get back on track with a strategic plan. And we'll hear from Tay on the Stabilize Maine People recommendations.
Thank you, Josh. I think as public servants and elected officials, you've heard from numerous constituents how difficult COVID and the economy has been, especially for populations. And so I chaired the Supportive Services Committee at ERC, and the 3 main focuses we looked at was housing, because in the time of pandemic, housing isn't just a basic need, but it was actually a safety need for so many families, because we didn't want families to move around. And so the kind of rental assistance that was needed was one of the things that we recommended, as well as childcare, because people who are at the lower end of the economic scale, they need to be able to get back to work, because so many of them, our society and communities depend on them because they were frontline workers. And so it was critical to have as much childcare support as possible. And lastly, we also wanted to make sure that we had basic needs for their populations, whether it was general assistance for newcomers, but really any kind of general assistance, whether it's SNAP, food benefits, those kind of things, so that people could be safe, because when they were safe, we were all safe. And those are the basic things that we looked at, and we hope that we can continue to invest in this, because all the economics show that the poverty rate is going up, especially for kids in poverty. And that is something that we can't take our eye off, because as you know, that they are going to be critical for our future economy.
Thanks, Tay. The next area we recommended investment in was to stabilize Maine employers. And this again was to prevent that permanent economic damage from happening before there was an opportunity to get on track with other recovery methods. And as you can see here, there was something like $350 million of employer grants that were recommended. And our feeling was those would be short-term in nature. And at the time that we were making these recommendations, I think no one knew how long the pandemic was going to go. But we felt like this would be a short-term measure that could get businesses through this summer. The final piece was to invest in Maine's infrastructure, and this was primarily around broadband and transportation. And these may seem like they were more appropriately fitting in the longer term 10-year recommendations, but in our view, because of the timeframes involved in bonding initiatives at the state, which you're all well aware of, we wanted to get the ball rolling so that if there was bonding potential, it would be something that could be taken up on the November ballot. And our view is that broadband was not just a long-term need, but it was a short-term need as well, as people were trying to access remote education, distance work, and telemedicine. And some of the timeframes involved in deploying that infrastructure are quite long. So we made that recommendation on the front end, knowing that we'd probably be back to infrastructure topics in the subsequent report.
The next phase of our work was to turn our attention after the July 15th report towards the future and towards the real bulk of what we were charged to do, is to sustain and grow this economy. And I would separate the two reports in this way. One is foundational, taking care of the current situation, taking care of our people, our businesses, and keeping them as whole as can possibly be expected in what seemed like a bit of a free fall in our economy. This piece that we were to turn our eyes to was the transformational piece, the important investments that would align us to get back on track towards the 10-year strategy that had just been published in November or December of 2019. And the vision of that strategy, which had been put together and agreed to by over 1,500 Maine people from all over the state, from all walks of life, was this vision that by 2030, Maine will be an international leader with a vibrant, sustainable, environmentally responsible economy. All across the state, the people of Maine will have access to an unmatched quality of life and good paying jobs. So as a result of the July 15th report, the governor and the administration actually made steps to invest over $1 billion in securing the foundation of our economy across those very categories that Tay and Josh explained. Now we rearranged our committees into 3 distinct committees of talent, innovation, and infrastructure. And the committees began anew to work together with their new teammates to form the recommendations in the areas of talent, innovation, and infrastructure that mapped towards this vision. We didn't want to replace the 10-year strategy. We wanted to build that solid path forward that would get us back on track towards achieving this vision. This part, which we completed our work for November 24th, puts forward 8 recommendations, 4 in the area of grow Maine's economy and 4 in the area of sustain Maine's people. And before I turn the mic back over to start talking about these various recommendations, I would group it as this. If you think about Maslow's hierarchy of need, we are in a knowledge-based, technology-driven global economy. It's very different from the past economies of Maine. You know, in the 1800s, we were predominantly working in agriculture, forestry, fishing, things of that nature, about 80% of our economy. By the 1900s, it was manufacturing. By the late 1900s, it was the service economy, and now it is knowledge-based. And to be knowledge-based and technology-driven means that talent, which is people, have to be included. They have to be have access to appropriate education. They have to be connected. Their basic needs have to be addressed. So as you look at these 8 recommendations, the base of that triangle of hierarchy of need is we have to take care of people. They are central. They are the piece that will drive our economy forward. And the second and kind of the full actualization of the vision are the 4 recommendations at the top, the grow Maine's economy. So we'll give you a little insight into those and then leave the real detail to a little later for you to probe, and we'll give the detail that accompanies it.
Thanks, Lori. The first recommendation in the Grow Maine's economy category is make a bold, strategic, and consistent investment in research and development for innovation within Maine's research and development community and businesses. And this was, I think, our single biggest ticket item in that we recommended $100 million year-over-year structural investment in R&D to bring Maine's spending on R&D up to comparable states as a percentage of GDP. So, underlying this story, Maine has historically underinvested in research and development, and this is the baseline of an economy that generates high quality, high paying jobs. And the challenge with research and development investment is that it's a long-term investment, and so it requires a lot of leadership to allocate scarce resources to something that's going to pay back later. We also made a host of recommendations around supporting entrepreneurship. And in particular, as we thought about entrepreneurship, we talked about how to mobilize all of Maine's people to participate in business startup and business scaling. And for us, that meant filling gaps in the entrepreneur ecosystem, providing access to capital, and being thoughtful to make sure that those measures were available to Mainers who may not have the same access to traditional programs and have had the same success in previous efforts to support this sector of the economy. And we're talking about women entrepreneurs, entrepreneurs of color, Native American entrepreneurs, and new Mainers who, as we'll talk about in a little bit, have been critical part of the entrepreneurship and small business startup ecosystem in Maine.
The second piece of that actually catalyzing growth is our talent base. And the studies that have been done globally of the regions that grow the most rapidly grow not because of the type of government or their natural resource base or the type of economy that is structured, but they grow because of their capacity for innovation, which is again developed in our people. So two of the major growth strategies are to invest much more strategically and comprehensively in developing the talent that we need to grow this economy and unleashing the potential of Maine's workforce by creating all kinds of a myriad of approaches to educational and training pathways that are accessible, that are affordable, and that will get people through to the finish line and to get the credentials that they need to really, really operate in an optimal and maximum way. So there are many recommendations within talent development to help bring more people in and give them opportunities to upskill and to get the credentials that they need to plug into the jobs that are available. We had talent shortages before this pandemic hit, and those talent shortages surprisingly still exist in some industries, the most rapidly growing, that need people with certain skills. And the higher eds are working hard and have been quite successful through this pandemic and are ready to emerge even stronger. The higher ed system across this state, there are the university campuses, the community colleges, and 10 private colleges. And together we have an extremely strong system. One of the greatest talent development that we can have is to place our students in internships, because if they have an internship in Maine, there's a great chance they'll stay and work in those companies. The second piece of that is to attract more talent. Because we're among the oldest, whitest states in the nation, our birth rates are low, and that cohort of new upcoming workers has been getting smaller and smaller for a number of years, and it hasn't hit its low point yet. So it's continuing to contract. So because of that, we have to welcome new people to our state and very strategically seek them to move here. And so the talent attraction pieces focus on making Maine an education destination. Come to Maine. If you'll send your students to summer camp, why won't you send them to college here? Because if we can get them here and get them into internships and integrated with the many opportunities in our state, we have a chance that they will choose Maine as a lifestyle. So really changing our thinking to not only attracting people to Maine to come visit our beautiful hospitality industry and all the scenery, but actually to come move and live here and participate in our economy.
Thanks, Lori. The next broad category was to sustain Maine's people. So we're moving from thinking about structural supports for the long-term development of Maine employers to focusing in on the people who support those employers and their families. And the first recommendation we had was to improve internet access. And our vision is for every Mainer to have a high quality internet connection. And when we talk about connectivity, we're not just talking about the physical infrastructure to connect everyone, which is quite important, but also the things they need to utilize the internet effectively, like sufficient number of computers or devices in their home so that 2 or more kids can go to school and 2 or more adults can participate in work at the same time. Internet connections that could support that before can't anymore today. And so we need broadband upgrades all over the place. Before the pandemic, the Connect Maine Authority said that Maine had a internet infrastructure deficit of about $600 million. And I think for those that are working over, aging copper infrastructure, they found that if they thought of themselves as served before, they may not think of themselves as well served now. And so we recommended significant investment in both that physical infrastructure and also investment in the things necessary to have people have the devices that they need and sort of the digital literacy and training necessary to make best use of the internet.
The second piece of this in talking about how we keep people engaged in the workforce, it was difficult for young families, families with young children before the pandemic hit. But when the schools closed, this concern around the availability of high quality childcare became extreme and very quickly. And the difficulty of re-engaging people in a workforce when they had children at home that needed care and oversight and direction in their schoolwork. Early care and education supports are, for a variety of reasons, one of the foundational and most important investments we can make. As you will see in preparing the legislative budgets, the largest general fund item is the K-12 system, or at least it was before, back when I used to work on revenue forecasting and whatnot, followed by human services. But our children are our future. And the K-12 system is in fact a system, and a huge investment is made there. To a little lesser extent, there's a huge investment in the higher ed system. And there is a university system and a community college system. But when you look at early care and education, there is no system, and it doesn't receive even a small portion of the support that the other systems get. Focusing on this is critically important for a variety of reasons. Simply put, parents cannot go to work if they don't know their children are in a safe and nurturing environment. It's impossible to concentrate and be productive at work if you're worried about your children. But even more importantly, for the long-term future of our state, 90% of a child's brain and all of the cognitive reasoning develops before the age of 5. If we wait until they're 5 to engage them in really a high quality educational experience, they will spend and we will spend many, many years and resources trying to bring them up to speed. And the greatest gift we can give the future economy is to make sure that every single child in Maine enters kindergarten ready to learn, to fully participate. Because then by the time they get to us in higher ed, they are ready to blossom to their full potential.
Thank you, Lori. So I'll be speaking about housing, and that's one of the mainstays of any community and in any household. Maine has one of the oldest housing stocks, but we also have one of the largest homeownership rates in the entire country. But that said, you're seeing housing spike up throughout the state of Maine, mainly because we've done such a great job with COVID. And I think it goes without saying, housing issue is a huge front and center issue for the city of Portland, just because you're seeing a disparity in the rental markets. And that said, for a lot of people in poverty that need stable housing, it's difficult to find it, simply because, according to Dan Brennan, the director of Maine Housing, the state of Maine needs to develop about 20,000 more affordable housing to be able to place most people in affordable housing. And that's really difficult to do. We just don't have that. So the state of Maine needs to figure out how to be more, I believe, innovative to be able to house. And one of the things that we're doing in the city of Portland is we just developed the largest co-op housing models. We're doing 3 sites in the city of Portland. What that co-op housing model does is it targets the missing middle. It's for people who can't afford, median income housing, and also people who don't qualify for Section 8 vouchers or public assistance. It's the frontline workers who are trying to figure out how they can stay in place. And so, we need to be more creative around housing people, whether it's making sure that people who are aging in place are able to do so, but also be able to create and help assets for young families to become homeowners so that they can stay in communities rather than move to larger service districts and deplete the neighborhoods there. The other piece that we talked about as far as sustaining Maine's people is really around demographics. We talked about addressing social inequities around marginalized populations, but what it really comes down to is an opportunity to be able to invest in the future workforce of Maine. So without multicultural, diverse populations moving to the state of Maine, Maine would have had no population growth in the last 10 years. So we are already seeing a demographic catastrophe where the oldest state in the nation with our median age is 45.1. We have more deaths than births. We have more people who are retired than we have people who are under the age of 20. And we've seen a shrinking workforce. We've seen a shrinking public education enrollment. And so, whenever someone moves to Maine, many of us are kind of disadvantaged. Like, it doesn't matter. I've been here for 45 years and I'm still considered from away. So some of those terminologies need to go away, and that kind of biases need to go away. And so in order to do that, we have to have a systemic strategy around being more inclusive and welcoming. And one of the ways to do that is to invest in a diversity work plan so that we just don't have a report and put it on a shelf, but it's something that we work on throughout the next 10 years. But also we need to find champions within state government to continue the conversation so that it doesn't go away. And really, when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, it's an opportunity that affects all the different strategies that we recommended. So for example, new Mainers that come to Maine, according to the SBA, are almost 2.5 times more likely to start a business. And they contribute $1.3 billion to just the greater Portland area and $300 million to the Lewiston area. And just in Portland and Lewiston alone, there's about 17,500 people of color living there, which is larger than the population of Piscataquis. And 50% of them are enrolled in some kind of education. So these are young populations that want to work, want to be educated, and want to be part of our community. In order to do that, we have to make sure that they're stabilized. And so, the measure of growth also states that for along the poverty levels, marginalized populations are either 2 to 3 times higher than white populations in poverty. So that means we need to figure out how we can improve housing stability, improve assistance, and also improve the educational pathway so that they can fully contribute and help us to create new markets. Because in the United States, half of all the kids under the age of 18 is multicultural. And if Maine wants to grow, we have to be intentional and recruit, retain, and welcome multicultural populations. In addition, they are going to be the future workforce and consumers of the United States. If you look at all the data, the fastest growing populations who are going to be consumers and workers are the multicultural population. And by 2044, they're going to be the majority of the population. And so if LL Bean and Wax and other Maine companies don't know how to sell to multicultural populations, we're at a disadvantage. And already they are considered one of the largest markets in the world. Their GDP is over $5 trillion, which would be right around where Germany and Japan is as far as GDP. And so if Maine is not intentional about selling to those populations, which is about 100 million people in the US, we're going to be left behind. And so, whether it's the workforce, innovation, talent retention, those are all strategies that DECD has to look at. And currently, the other piece is that we have almost 10,000 students of color in our colleges and universities in the state of Maine, and we don't really have a strategy to figure out how to keep them here, because we all worry about brain power leaving the state of Maine. But if we have multicultural brain power here, we got to figure out what kind of systemic strategies do we have to make sure that they have the apprenticeships and they have the internships so that they have a more positive experience here and want to be employed and work or maybe start a business in Maine.
So as we talk about all of these recommendations, one of the things in the forefront of our minds was that as we went into the longer term recommendations, the more expensive recommendations, we didn't have sitting in front of us a pot of federal funds that were highly flexible that could be drawn on for implementation. And so we recognize that we are neither as a committee implementers nor appropriators. And as you look towards this term in the legislature, we understand there's going to be incredibly difficult financial choices. I think I heard this morning that as part of the compromise federal stimulus bill, state and local support was taken out in favor of dropping the issue of liability protections for employers. And so, it does appear that the financial choices that we're going to have to make in the coming year or years will be incredibly difficult, and it will be very, very challenging to find a way to fund new initiatives in the face of cuts. And so we had some specific thoughts around that. And the first is that there's never been a better time to bond in Maine than right now, with interest rates at a historic low and the level of need so high right now. And so as we think about making investments, not just in general operating budgets, but in things that ought to pay back over a time frame, in the health of our people and the growth of our economy, in the increase in taxes and revenue sources from various areas, we felt that bonding at this time should be bolder and more aggressive than it would be on a normalized basis. We also felt strongly that Maine has existing institutions that have been highly successful at providing economic supports in a targeted and well-managed fashion. One of the reasons you don't see a lot of headlines about FAME and MTI and the Maine Venture Fund is that they do their jobs quietly and competently. And there's not a lot of scandal around the work that they do because it goes so well. But I'll use the same phrase we used at the Appropriations Committee yesterday, which is that despite the fact that these are very successful programs and very well-run organizations, we're playing small ball in the level of support that we give them. And so we made recommendations that we scale those existing institutions. For example, in FAME, give them the capital resources necessary to provide much more aspirational and larger loan guarantees, for example, and to have MTI and the Maine Venture Fund make bigger and bolder investments, because ultimately, whether we're talking about a new startup with a high aspiration to be nationally competitive, or an existing business or organization making a structural investment along the way, so some of these investments to be really meaningful are quite large, and we felt like we could scale those organizations.
The 8 recommendations that were put forth that were very central to our charge, we arrived at full consensus as a committee. But recognizing that our 45 committee members were from all parts of our state and many, many industries were represented, for-profits, nonprofits, healthcare, education, all across the spectrum. We realized that we needed to be very prioritized in what we put forward for catalyzing growth. But we felt we also needed to share what we thought were some of the priorities for the foundational pieces. Many of these will come before you for your decision making. And there were 5 areas that was very strong support of the committee that we share some ideas, and those are in the report as well. And they fall in terms of these areas. The public health infrastructure needs great strengthening. Modernizing the state's regulatory environment, the way that we regulate has been somewhat burdensome over the past. And as this pandemic has shown, we need new ways of issuing licenses and certificates and whatnot. So modernizing that system would be really important for our future. Investing in agriculture, fisheries, and aquaculture so that the food chain can be complete. And when the chain, the supply chain is stopped for some reason, pandemic or otherwise, we can get our food distributed to our people. And so that is a piece that is worthy of some strategic investment as well. Supporting Maine's workers are central to surviving and thriving, and investing in the all-important transportation infrastructure that is really the basis of our economic activity. We did face a challenge, however, with our 8 recommendations and the foundational pieces as well. We understand that the full potential of these recommendations are simply not possible unless and until the virus is under control and Maine's public health infrastructure is strong. The federal government invests fully in stabilizing the economy through additional federal stimulus, and the structural inequities are addressed so that truly all Maine people can reach their fullest potential. We'd like to turn it over to questions. We do have some detail of how the earlier monies were spent, but the governor invested over $1 billion in the very issue areas that Tay and Josh articulated in terms of childcare, pre-K-12, business and nonprofit supports, and other monies. But I think we should probably turn our attention to the questions that you may have, and we can give you the greater detail.
I would also note we have not, because we were in presentation mode here, we were not absorbing the questions as they were coming through the chat. And so if you are a questioner in the chat, this would be a great time just to surface that, and we'll be happy to get into it. We recognize how fast we went through each of those policy areas. You could imagine, teams on our committee spent weeks working on. So this was a very high flyover.
It looks like there are a couple in the chat. So Rachel Talbot Ross had a question about investment African American and Native American communities for workforce diversity and business development beyond the 7 million.
I was just typing the answer. I said it is a good question. The $7 million is really for general assistance for people who are not currently covered. Our strategy is really to invest about $1 million to do a DEI audit, to do a DEI 10-year work plan, so that we can try to focus on all multicultural populations. As you know, the multicultural population in the state of Maine, including Native Americans and African Americans, and Hispanic Americans, biracial, and Asian Americans, is almost 100,000 people, which would make it the 6th largest population county in the state of Maine. And if you include the 10,000 students of color, some of them are residents of Maine, but it would be over 100,000 people. And right now, we don't have a comprehensive strategy to figure out how we can incorporate over 100,000 people to be part of our workforce, part of our entrepreneurial space, and figure out how we can support everyone so that they can live to their full and best potential. So it's really that $1 million to kind of do the planning grant and also to hire champions within specific departments so that they can have big levers and be able to have influence in decision makers every day, so that that DEI, that compass isn't lost within certain departments. And for example, it could be DHHS, DOL, professional license, Department of Education, DECD, places like that, that would affect a lot of people as far as education, business, and workforce.
Chip Curry, Senator Curry has a question.
Yes, can you speak a little bit more about the modernizing the regulatory environment and the process?
So one of the subcommittees had highlighted that the various permitting processes for site development, particularly around environmental regulations, had sort of timelines and review capacity that needed to be truncated and expanded respectively. And so I don't have a lot of further texture on what specific regulatory level is there, but it was around site development and environmental regulation, not to go after the regulations, but to add resources and compress timelines in the review process.
Great, thank you.
There is a question in the chat about what were the reactions and results from your July report? And are there ways to measure the effectiveness of the ERC? Was the committee too large, or was broad representation key to success? So I'll take those one at a time, and others can pitch in. When we produced our July report, the governor had been given the CARES Act fund monies. And what I believe happened, and what we saw to be true, is the committee was able to give some priority order on how those monies might be expended. And the immediacy of need in the K-12 system, so that they could actually get students back into school. Our report came out July 15th, and the schools had really 2 months to figure it out how they were going to get their students back. So one of the largest investments that was made was in the K-12 system, but also in the very immediate need of childcare. Those monies were funneled very quickly. Housing, so that people weren't removed from their housing, which would further exacerbate issues for young families if they get displaced in housing. That makes the education of our children even more difficult. And then after those basic needs were addressed in July and early August, the Department of Economic and Community Development opened up a $200 million investment in economic recovery grants for businesses across the state to apply for. And towards the end of recently, getting a little closer to our second report, another $40 million investment was made in the hospitality and retail industries particularly. So the committee was able to take the time to prioritize and to express with some consideration and strength the immediacy of certain investments over others. And I think the governor and the administration stepped forward and made investments accordingly. There was also a major investment made in broadband and in securing our healthcare system that was under such incredible stress with the additional issues of operating in a pandemic. The committee was large, but it was the diversity of voices from experience and the relative geographic position in the state that made the results stronger. We could not operate as a committee of a whole very often. That was too much. That would be totally ineffective. But by breaking it into the subcommittees, everybody had a voice. And it was truly the subcommittees that did the work, that brought forward the recommendations and started to prioritize them. And then the committee as a whole was able to come to a broad consensus after that. Josh, anything you want to add to that?
I would just say another important outcome of the committee was helping to orient and really participate with members, staff members of the delegation, who for each of our senators and congressmen that that we have in the state had staff members that were embedded in the ERC. And of course, one of our target audiences, in addition to Maine policymakers, was federal policymakers. As you know, if you read the report, you'll see in the introduction, it calls for significantly more federal support to fill, not just general budget gaps, but provide opportunity for investment within the state. So, what I view that as an important outcome that those messages have carried forward to Washington. I would also note that as you see in the legislature, coming to consensus with a broad group of people from every political stripe and sector and geographic focus can be quite challenging. And I think, we probably took up, I'll hazard a guess, at about 100 major issues. We sort of landed on 8 as the most important, with a few other supporting issues. And I think we had 2 issues in the whole committee that, were either divisive or we couldn't come to consensus on. And so all of the things that we advanced on a consensus basis. In other words, there was no one standing up and saying, I just can't live with this. And so while we couldn't agree on everything, the fact that in the midst of everything that's going on in the increasingly polarized environment that we operate in, such a diverse group was able to agree on that 8 gave me some confidence that the 8 really made sense. It made sense on a bipartisan basis. It made sense on a pan-state basis. It made sense on a temporal basis, like the time is now for those things. And so, we recognize that the big challenge here is how do we find funding? But we felt like we wouldn't have done our jobs as a committee if we hadn't narrowed it down a bit, because ultimately, as legislators, you'll all see that there is so much absolute need and there are so many important issues. How do you boil it down to the essential for our limited political bandwidth, right? There's only so much time to take up all these difficult and technical things. And there's certainly limits on resources. So our feeling was we wanted to send a strong message that these were the things that needed the most attention in this moment as we think about a longer term recovery.
There's a great question in the chat. That is, can we brainstorm a bit about how to leverage bond funding to address the 0 to 4 early care and early education development puzzle? Great question. And I think great opportunity here as well. And I'm not the one to speak so much to the ability to bond on this, but we've been working through Educare Central Maine. And if you haven't seen Educare, I urge you to tour. It is the absolute gold standard on how you deliver the highest quality early care and education from birth through and preparing them to kindergarten. It is a model that is a national standard. And I've been on the board for a number of years. Children who come from really abject poverty enter the Educare system. They have a very immersive high care environment that is, the research goes along with it every single year on their progress and their full development. Parents are empowered and engaged and learn how to advocate for themselves and their children and bringing them into it. Their basic needs of dentist care and health care are provided. And what has happened is over the years, we see that these children who were at great risk enter kindergarten at or above other students, and they're ready to learn, and they are launched in a highly successful manner. Taking that model beyond the walls of the Educare building, there's been an investment made by local philanthropists across the state, a group called the Maine Early Learning Investment Group, and they, along with some federal dollars, have extended the high quality practices and programming of Educare to the Skowhegan area, which also has a great deal of poverty. And they have had enormous results by working with the local childcare providers there in homes to upgrade the skills and the way they approach their childcare. Their evidence-based practices are brought to the small family-run childcares, as well as the centers in the area. And we have found enormous results taking Educare beyond the walls. If we could bond for a product like that, a program that expands to all areas of our state, it's not just about a big fancy building, it's about the programming, the way the childcare providers are trained, engaged, they have a support system, they learn how to help parents become even more effective parents. And I believe if Educare was taken beyond the walls with the help of maybe some bond funding, you could take care of a bigger, much bigger group by working with local YMCAs and Boys and Girls Clubs and Catholic charities, anybody who take care of children in large numbers. We could lift that quality and care, and more importantly, the results statewide. So I would think that would be a very exciting opportunity that you may take a good look at.
I see that Leanne Williams asks in the chat, would you expand a bit upon the investments and actions that would be included under the transportation infrastructure? So we recommended a $250 million 2-year investment in transportation infrastructure. And if you follow transportation funding, a lot of support for transportation in Maine comes from the essentially what has become an annual transportation bond referendum, which passes with overwhelming support, and it's typically around $100 million. And so we are not talking about $250 million above that level. We're talking about $250 million total in 2 years. So think of it as a $50 million two-year increase or a $25 million a year increase. For those not close to transportation policy, the Department of Transportation in Maine is responsible for much more than roads. They're also responsible for, airport and port and rail infrastructure, among other things. And so if you were to unpack what that $250 million is, in addition to catching up on things like bridge rehabilitation, it also includes pedestrian improvements on streets. It includes port upgrades and infrastructure, considering what the Climate Council has been recommending around, investments in the green economy here in Maine. We need port infrastructure upgrades to handle the size materials that'll be coming and going for some of the offshore wind that's been contemplated, rail investments, airport investments. And so it's sort of a broad range of infrastructure types, and it's about a $50 million increase on a 2-year basis. I would note some of our members felt very strongly. We were lucky to have participants from the legislature as members, and some had been involved in appropriations, and they made the very strong point that it's wonderful that there's been such support for the annual transportation bond, but it might indicate that there's a structural problem in thinking how we fund the Department of Transportation if we have to go every year rely on a referendum bond issue. We may need to look at a more sustainable and predictable form of funding. But I think in the very short term, while we're thinking about very inexpensive debt in this moment and the necessity to get people back to work and thinking about the revenue impacts on a state basis of getting those people back to work, an increase that covered sort of multimodal sort of transportation upgrades would be important.
Can someone speak to the idea? There's a question that speaks to, you talked about leveraging and expanding our existing capital investment organizations like FAME and CEI. And there's quite a bit of discussion about establishing a green accelerator or a green bank. Does anybody have information on that?
Lori, I don't have any particular insight into the green bank aspect, but just in terms of banking and financing in general, if I could offer a few thoughts, I was thinking about this. I think first of all, as policymakers, be very clear in your thinking about what is a loan product versus what really needs equity, patient capital, something that doesn't necessarily have to be paid back, something that's at risk. And so when you use the word bank, that implies a loan. And that has very, interesting characteristics and constraints. But a lot of times what people need is actually an equity investment, whether it's something like Maine Venture Fund, whether it's something like MTI. So I just urge you as policymakers to be clear in talking with constituents and advocates about what it is that companies and entrepreneurs really need. Because often they don't have the ability to support a conventional loan even a subsidized conventional loan. Second, when interest rates are really low, as the panelists have been talking about, oftentimes subsidized loans aren't the trick because interest rates are already ridiculously low and banks are already trying to keep their borrowers afloat. So, again, it may take something even more creative than banking. And then just the final thought, and you have entities like FAME and SBA, and the question may be, what is it that they don't have the tools to do, and how can you build on an existing entity? It is always easier to expand the resources or mandate of an existing entity. That would just be my thought. And then finally, take advantage of what's unique about the financial landscape in Maine. Full disclosure, I worked at Bangor Savings Bank for 12 and a half years. But here's the interesting thing about Maine. About 2/3 of Maine's financial market is local banks and credit unions. That is the exact inverse of the country as a whole. So take advantage of the fact that you've got a ton of locally based financial institutions with a ton of skilled people, a ton of loan loss reserves out there, and try to figure out if you can learn from the Maine Credit Union League and the banking community. Is there a way, to your question, to provide something that would encourage the existing providers to meet the need quicker and more efficiently than something brand new? So they might not be able to, but I think it's always a good place to start.
100% agreement with Yellow's comments there. I think, hopefully some of that came through in the financing note, and, very specifically when we think about what tools can we give these existing organizations and programs that provide financing support in Maine, it's about scale and it's about mandate. I do think that it's important to remember that, bonding can only support capital investment. And so to the extent that there's operational deficits or gaps in funding businesses, there needs to be other more flexible money available. And so as you think about, putting together budgets, to the extent that, annual budget is supporting capital items at a time when we're highly constrained, think about if those could be pushed to bonding, and then the more flexible annual budget monies could be used for something else.
The only thing I would add is that, in a recession or a down economy, you're going to see more people be entrepreneurial, and a lot of them are also going to have hits on their credit. And so it's not necessarily the ability to get, access to capital. It's the ability to be approved for a loan. So having more local banking products with lower thresholds as far as not having collateral or maybe a lower credit score, and working with more assistance could be of value, especially during this time. And that would be true for a lot of marginalized populations who may come to the United States with absolutely no credit. And also for, families in poverty that want to start a business.
You see in the chat, Stacy Brenner asked in our conversations about entrepreneurial development if the need to untangle employee-based healthcare came up as a barrier. And I would say I didn't hear that we had taken that up in any of our subcommittees. I agree, it's a huge problem as an employer whose second biggest expense is healthcare. This is certainly an issue from my perspective. I suspect we didn't take it up because it's a national issue and one that we didn't necessarily have a lever on as recommenders in the ERC, but I agree it's important.
Lois Reckett is asking a question around the disproportional impact of this pandemic on unemployment of women in particular, and women in the workforce, and which of your priorities would begin to cover this issue. Probably there are a number of them. Certainly the early care and education one is one in particular. And Maria may have these numbers, but we have numbers on the percentage of Maine households that are with children that are led by women, single parents, and as well as young households where the mother had been in the workforce, but frequently it's the mother that chooses to leave the workforce to take care of the children, particularly if they're not in school 5 days a week. So I think the early care and education becomes critically important for women in particular to be able to even re-engage in the workforce, which we so desperately need them to do. We need everybody's skills and abilities put to work in our economy. So other thoughts on that?
Sure. We also recommended in our supportive services, a sustainable support services committee was assistance around SNAP benefits, but we also tried to advocate for elder care and also for after school care because a lot of young working families, led by, female households, they're taking care of their elderly parents as well as maybe adults with disabilities or, and then having to juggle between, early child care versus after school child care. It makes it very difficult for a lot of families to kind of juggle that. So those are things that we advocated for, but, we landed on childcare because that was the consensus of the committee.
There's one that says question about talent development.
Yeah, hi, Dr. Lucci. Buddy, it's Representative Ed Crockett. And I'll apologize first because I came into this meeting a little late. I was in another meeting. And I came into it when you guys were talking about talent development. And I had a question with respect to that. We know talent development is tied immensely into higher education. And with respect to Mainers getting higher education, most Mainers get stymied by the cost of higher education. And as a result, too many go into heavy debt. So my question is, are there any recommendations in the report on how to make higher education more affordable for young Mainers?
There was some discussion around access to higher education, which of course is affordability. But I would just say, as a college president, our college serves 2/3 of our students are first in their family to go to college. And the average household income is extremely low, among some of the lowest of that all colleges serve in the state. And so there are many aspects to this. With the end game in mind, we did learn from one of our speakers out of Georgetown University that for the ability to earn an income, a wage of $55,000 or above to secure a job that paid at that level, the jobs of the future would require between 85 and 100% of the workers to have a bachelor's degree. So the ability to earn at the highest levels and secure a stable part of life for your family requires education. But what has happened is we've had an old system of how we approach education, but that system is evolving. And I'll give you an example. And I'll just give you an example. Other colleges are doing this too, but what we're doing, for example, this is a labor-intensive business, teaching children, teaching young people, young adults. So you can't just cut your way through it or automate the teaching. So that means, to Josh's earlier point, not only do you have to keep people employed, but healthcare benefits are one of the biggest drivers of costs. So given that it is the cost side of the way we offer is high, how would we cut expenses or how would we change? And so it's changing very quickly in a number of ways that affect affordability. Number one, the state has started over the last 5 to 10 years to develop college level courses that are given in the high schools so that when students come to college, they already have college credit, which means they can accelerate through faster and not take on as much debt. Our little college, we have 800 undergraduate students in our college, but we have 1,000 students in Maine high schools who are taking our classes for free early college credit. Many of them, all of them come with at least some early college credit. And they can immediately use it to shorten how long they're in college. In addition, our college, because we don't receive any kind of public funding, we have developed bachelor's degrees that can be attained in 3 years by accelerating through those 3 years. That shaves an entire year off the cost of college and allows people to get in the workforce faster. So that can cut debt by minimally 25%. Plus, you don't have to forego another year of income. Or you can stay the 4th year and earn your master's degree and enter the workforce at a higher salary. So we need to blow up the old model. The old model for hundreds of years says you don't start college till you're 18 or 19 and you go for 4 years. It doesn't have to be that way. And so change up the models, get them through faster, get them into the job market. Paid internships are another way that can help alleviate the cost of college and taking on debt. So we've committed right now, over 80% of all of our students have internships. And through the Alphon Foundation, we're able to pay for many of those. So if a small business wants an intern, we can get them an intern who can do on-the-job training to help work for that business afterwards. But we can pay for that, so our student doesn't have to choose between an unpaid internship or their subway job or a job that isn't in their field. It allows them to get experience in the field, which helps the workforce, it helps the employers, and it helps the colleges. So we frequently think of cutting the cost of college by just cutting the cost somehow. But given it's labor intensive, we have to think more broadly about it. The speed you go through, the way you go through, getting that internship experience, all of those can not only cut the cost of college altogether, get people in the workforce faster, but allow them to complete their degree. Because the very worst situation is to have some debt and no college degree to pay for that debt. So finishing is critically important. And there are over 100,000 Maine adults who have some college and no degree. And allowing them to actually earn the return on that investment they've already made is probably one of the most important investments that you folks could make, getting them to completion so they can get a return on that investment. So those are just a few ideas.
If I could jump in here for a second, one of the things that I don't think the panelists have had as much chance to talk about, so I just wanted to draw folks' attention to it, is this emphasis on public-private partnerships. There's a lot that the legislature and the state and the feds can do, but there's a lot of mentions in the report about public-private partnerships as the foundation. A lot of those partnerships already are drawing competitive grant funds. I'll mention the Forest Opportunity Roadmap. There's a Sea Maine effort trying to generate future opportunities for marine products. There's an offshore wind roadmap, all of which are attracting existing competitive federal investments as well as local match. So, think about one thing I would think about as a policymaker for bang for my buck would be, where are some existing situations where with some modest match I can boost an existing public-private partnership. And I think that ethos is scattered throughout the ERC report as well.
Yeah, another important area, I think, for the public-private partnership sort of ethic that Yellow is highlighting is in the research and development funding. So when we think about research and development, it is the quintessential public-private partnership, as much of research and develop happens in the public university system. But it's done in partnership with businesses who bring applications and a roadmap for commercialization, as well as sort of the critical intern-extern participation in that R&D. And so I feel pretty strongly that a fundamental investment in R&D, where the dollars may flow quickly to some of the state research institutions, helps bolster the overall position of higher ed. To Representative Crockett's earlier point about affordability, but also provides a pathway for collaboration between the public through its university systems and and business. And what we've seen with the Rue Institute investment, for example, is that large investments in workforce development, particularly ones that attract higher tech businesses, will typically bring leverage quickly for the participation of employers. And so I think closely partnering with employers in research and development and education will be an important part of any roadmap for investment.
Yeah, and then one legislative process suggestion, and maybe returning members will second me or shoot me down on this. I know cloture is today for some standalone legislation submissions. The governor can always submit a governor's bill at any time. That's her prerogative. But I would say a lot of complex issues like this, even if there's individual bills pending, often are the fodder for the development of a committee bill. So as you start working with your committee colleagues, committees can usually seek and receive permission from the Legislative Council to develop a consensus package, which is often stronger than using any individual legislator's proposal, of which you may not have had time to submit anyway, given the deadlines, and sometimes even stronger than a governor's bill, because it has that organic collaboration between the committee and the executive branch to develop a package at the committee level. So think about how to use your committees to develop consensus, regardless of what you or your colleagues put in today by the deadline.
I would just like to recommend, I'm sure Lori knows more specifics, but I think there needs to be some kind of incentive for first generation college students to finish. And that incentive, I believe, comes from internships. And if you can create an incentive for businesses to create internships for first generation college students, because really, people who have connections are going to get their kids, internships, but first generation families not. And that's where that disparity comes into play usually. So if you're a first generation college student and you don't know anyone in the business world, and you really don't know where you're going because you're not really getting guidance from home because no one in your family's really gone down that path, how are you going to find a job in the professional world without some kind of mentorship or without some sort of insight into what to do next? And I think apprenticeships and internships for first generation college students, whether it's through a TRIO program, but make it bigger, but I mean, that's a way to help people get to the finish line. And it just saddens me that we have over 100,000 Mainers who didn't get there. So that would be a huge incentive.
You're absolutely right, Tay. And just again, we have to reimagine education. It's one thing to just take a look at the way it's always been, but it's going to implode if we just try to keep delivering in the same way. First generation, we specialize at that in our college. And there are 3 reasons that young people leave college. There's the academic aspect, the social aspect, and the financial aspect. And the financial one actually is the easiest, because if you invest the money to help, to Tay's point, with either paid internships or helping to cover tuition costs or room and board or books or whatever it is, we can address that. The academic one is obviously, it requires a different set of supports, but the social one is the hardest. I was a first gen. I remember getting from my small hometown of Dover Foxcroft and landing on an elite college campus and felt lost, completely lost, unwelcomed, unworthy, that never felt I could succeed in that. It's all up here. That's a huge piece. That's much harder to solve than writing a check or even giving tutoring supports. So it's all 3. It can't be just one. There's no simple answer. We've tried to address it comprehensively in a huge manner of ways. Jobs for Maine's graduate. They have the same challenge, but in middle school and high school. They find the most at-risk young people, most at risk of not graduating from high school, and they surround them and include them in a culture of support and development. And it strengthens confidence and networks and the ability to be resilient. And our Jobs for Maine's graduate is the most successful in the country and has been for 24 straight years, #1. So Thomas partnered with JMG since we serve the very same students, and we formed a college level JMG program at Thomas so that we could receive those students. So as they transitioned from high school, they had a place they immediately felt comfortable and welcomed, and they knew the culture and they knew they could sustain, and it gave them immediate support system. Since then, we were the first in the nation, and that was only a few years ago, and now it's in our university system and in our community college system. So finding new ways of supporting young people. We created an esports program. You know, one of the greatest issues that Maine has is, I call them the lost boys, but there are a significant number of young people, predominantly males, between the age of 16 and 24, who are neither in school nor at work. They are not productively engaged in Maine and in our economy and our communities. And we need to find a way to engage them. We cannot allow them to sit on the sideline. So we have to find a way to, say, lure them in. So many of them, and I'm generalizing, I realize, but many of them are really, really good at video games. And so we have formed a varsity esports team with the same benefits of a varsity soccer or baseball or basketball team, because a way to get young people to succeed through college is to give them a mentor, to give someone they respect and can call on in the ups and downs, who will monitor whether they're going to classes, who will make sure they're taking care of themselves, paying their bills, staying on track. They're part of a team. They're learning strategy, teamwork, creativity, all the things that businesses need. And if you find a way to engage young people where they are and affirm that they're good at something and use that strength to also give them an education, again, it's just another way of bringing people in, affirming the strengths they do have and helping them build on that. So there's many, many ways. We know nationally, the studies show to get people to complete college most successfully, they need an internship, to Tay's point, critically important, a paid one where they're treated as a real worker. Those are the most successful and the most productive and have the greatest results for everybody. A long-term project, so they know how to persist with something that's not going to be immediately met, that takes time, and a certificate of value. So maybe they get a badge in some computer skills or some skills in their industry that they want to pursue, so that they can graduate with more than just knowledge, but also skills and attributes that business work use. So it's just an opportunity to reimagine.
Thank you, Lori. Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I'll never forget this quote from David Silvernail. He was an educator, and when I was on the school committee, he gave me this statistic. He said the college aspiration for the poorest kid in the class, but with the highest grades, had the same college aspiration as the richest kid with the lowest grades in the class. So, you know, when I went to, you know, elite college, just like Lori, I remember thinking all these kids were belly aching about what kind of options they had when they graduated, and I had no idea what to even study. So they, you know, not only was I behind academically because they were coming from private schools, but they already had options when they were going to graduate. And so that kind of navigator is critical for first generations, not just for first generation college students, but also for new Mainers in the workforce. And so what happens with a lot of workforce issues is that when you've got people who are new to a system and they're expected to kind of survive on their own without really understanding the landscape or the culture or the mores or the options, expectations are always missed from the employer to the employee. Same thing with first generation students. They may know they're smart enough, but they don't know how to navigate the system socially. So their expectations are sometimes lost. So the more navigators or connections we can have, the more we can, you know, treat workforce and education as communities, I think the better chance we have, because it would, everything, all the statistics show that it's upside down as far as population. There are more people over the age of 50 to 65 than there are people under the age of 30. Like, so we're going to have more people that are going to be dependent on transfer income and fewer people who are entering the workforce. And so we have to figure out how to increase that workforce pipeline.
Thank you. I want to wrap up here because it's approaching 9:30. I want to say just a huge thank you to Lori, Josh, and Tay for today, but also to them and their ERC colleagues for the entire year. I mean, these are a group of citizen volunteers who put in unbelievably extensive effort and hours. We owe them a huge debt of gratitude. This pandemic has magnified and exposed the challenges and opportunities for talent, innovation, and infrastructure that were always there. Now they have a new dimension, a new context, and even greater urgency. And I think as I've been talking to folks the last few weeks, more than ever, we need the kind of vision from the ERC to guide what limited resource investments we can make so that we can make this the best possible recovery and the best possible long-term pathway for Maine that we can. I want to thank Julie Bean and Mike Higgins from my team. Thank you to Maria for helping us put this together. In the chat, there's a survey assessment tool so we can harvest. It's really short. Please fill that out if you can and give us feedback so we know what's working. Please check your junk folder and your whitelist settings if you're not regularly getting our emails. We know some of you have had problems with that, so we want to get through to you to make sure that we're reaching you. And starting the second Friday in January, we've got 4 more sessions on innovation, infrastructure, talent, and the budget. So, you know, actually, please spread the word to your colleagues as those come out, and we'll be approaching committee chairs because those topics will more closely match the mandate of many of the committees that you serve on. So if they match the mandate of your committee, policy committee, you know, please talk to your chairs if you would, or if you are the chair, you know, please look at those as learning opportunities for your whole committees to take advantage of. We'll generally take a committee chair or co-chair from the ERC and then build other public and private collaborator voices around them. So we'll tie into the conversation we just had. So thank you so much for participating. Thank you for our 3 ERC members for leading this conversation. Mike, Julie, is there anything we're missing before we sign off?
I think we're good, Yellow.
Thanks so much. Have a great holiday season and a happy new year, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks.